Hello everybody and welcome back for today's Music Lit 1 class. I hope this message finds you guys healthy, well, and safe. Listen, what we're going to be talking about today is romantic chamber music, both vocal and instrumental. And the title that I decided to give this lecture is Stories in Song. This has to do partly with the fact that this is how this music was conceived and understood, performed, and listened to in the 19th century, which means that this is how we would do best to understand it today. But it's also because that ties it together with the large-scale, very extroverted, much less intimate music that we were looking at last time in Beethoven's Middle Vienna period. So remember the connecting tissue is that this music is supposed to be music which somehow tells a story, engages the listeners and performers' imagination in a different way such that they understand this progression from beginning to end of a piece. It's not just a piece of music that's to be listened to as notes, whether there are words or not. What you're supposed to be doing is following along with a progression from some sort of beginning to through the middle to the end. All of that is supposed to be a journey of sorts. So let's get started talking about stories in song, vocal and instrumental chamber music of the Romantic. Okay, so the first thing I want to remind you of is that all of the music that we are listening to today, looking at today, is music that was written during the Restoration. This is the period which we've already discussed briefly in this class, from 1815, when Napoleon Bonaparte was vanquished and the ruling powers of Europe set up a stable and peaceful political structure, up until 1848, when Europe once again erupted in a wave of revolutions that were born of the notion that, you know what, Napoleon was a really cruel and vicious military dictator for all of us, but what we did when we restored that peace and tranquility in 1815 was to also betray a number of the ideals of the French Revolution, which were the things that had empowered Napoleon to begin with. So basically, the Restoration is the period from 1815 to 1848 in Europe. This includes everything except for Russia. For what it's worth, you should know that this wave of revolutions that ends the Restoration also spreads worldwide. It's a huge wave of issues in the United States and Central and South America and Canada. It is an incredible year in the middle of the 19th century at the end of this period. That's where we go next, but for today we're looking at vocal and instrumental chamber music of the Restoration. Now, the key feature to remember here is that the Restoration was a period where, for the first time in a full generation since the 1790s, all of Europe could be at home. Families were at home together, making music together, spending time together. The fathers and the sons and uncles and nephews and cousins and things like that were not off at war. Instead, Europe was at peace. And Europe absolutely loved this, which means that these families who were together for the first time in a generation spent a lot of time making music. This was the period, the Restoration was the period in which European literacy grew to an incredible, absolutely staggering rate of somewhere in the 90%. The highest figure I've seen is 98, the lowest is 91, right? But think about it. If you think about the ability to read and write at a level that would be today's graduating high school student, what do you think the percentage in the United States today would be of that kind of literacy? I will tell you, that level of literacy is 13 to 15%, right? In Europe, in the period 1815 to 1848, that level of literacy was in the 90s. So it was a world that loved reading. It was also a world that loved musically passing time together. And that means that it is a flourishing for chamber music, music which could be played in small quarters, did not require a big concert hall or even recital hall. And the other defining feature of chamber music, whether it is vocal or instrumental in its composition, is that it uses one person on a part. So when you're talking about instrumental chamber music, say the string quartet, one player per part. Vocal chamber music, solo voice or voices if there's more than one voice part, with one keyboard player. You don't have a choir, you just have soloists singing and making music together. This is music that lends itself well to use in the home. Now, when we talk about vocal instrumental music, one of these conditions, again, derives from the fact that this is music to be made in individuals' homes, right? Composers write with the notion that a family is going to pick up their latest song and sing it at home on a Thursday or Friday or Saturday night. Those people do not have Netflix and Spotify to distract them. They don't have any of those latter-day distractions. What they do have is a piano and a desire to learn music. So there's a huge amount of vocal chamber music that is produced. For those of us who are looking back at this history, the first thing we have to do is figure out how to understand it, and that means how to classify it. The first thing to do when we look at vocal chamber music is to look at its language. This doesn't mean the country of the composer, it means the language of the piece as it is written, right? So, music that was for voices, usually with piano accompaniment and written in German, falls into one of three categories, either Lied, the plural of which is Lieder, or Gesang, the plural of which is Gesänge, or Ballade. We'll talk about those three in just a moment. If you're speaking of French music, vocal chamber music, you're talking about the mélodie, the chanson, or the romance. Those are three different styles of vocal chamber music in the French language in the Restoration. And in Spanish, the two main forms were the tonada and the tonadilla. Again, two different styles, their defining feature, and what they share together is that they are in Spanish. Now, the other feature to look at is the style itself. So let's talk about the German stuff, because that's where today's lecture is going to be centered. German vocal chamber music is classified as a Lied if it is simple in style, which is to say, an obviously predominant voice part with an obviously subordinate accompaniment. Usually, the style and the form of a Lied is strophic, meaning that it reuses the same text or the same music for successive verses of the text. If this music is more complicated in style, but does not use a narrator, then it's classified as a Gesang, plural Gesänge. And if the music is more complicated in style and uses a narrator, someone who actually gives you a text and tells you what is happening, then it's classified as a ballade in German. If we are in French, what we talk about is melody, is music that is simple in style in the character of a folk song, in which case it is called a chanson. If it is music which has more complicated vocal and instrumental writing, more complicated harmonies, is not something that would sound like a folk song, then it's classified in French as a mélodie. And if we are in Spanish, if it's more complicated in style, we call it a tonada. And if it's a simpler piece, like the Lied or like the chanson, then we call it a tonadilla. So another way of thinking of everything I just said is that the Lied is the counterpart to the chanson, which is the counterpart to the tonadilla. The difference between those three genres is the language, German, French, or Spanish, respectively. Similarly, the Gesang is something which is the counterpart to the French mélodie and the counterpart to the Spanish tonada. The other genre that we've named is the ballade, and it's worth telling you that in French and Spanish they do not differentiate between forms that do or don't use a narrator. So the what would be the German ballade is very often usually classified as a mélodie in French or as a tonada in Spanish. Are you guys still with me? I got a little bit drawn out in that last segment. So what's happening here next is that we're talking about how to understand what's going on in any given piece of this vocal chamber music of the Restoration. And the first thing that we talk about there is the basic process of creation. Please understand that these are not pieces, for the overwhelming majority anyway, that are written by the composer. These are pieces of music that take a pre-existing text and set it to music. So, for example, you have people who write a poem, publish that poem, and many people read that published poem by a given poet. Let's say the poet is Goethe or Heine, right? Those people know it, they understand that poem in this extremely literate public that has a voracious appetite for literature, and they've got their own understanding of what it is about. Among those readers might be a composer who says, you know what, this piece of poetry makes me want to write a piece of music, and I'm going to set it to music. When this composer does this, that is called setting a piece of music, and it gives the composer the right in this romantic imagination to interpret in the music. So one of the characteristics of 19th century song that is different from 18th century song is that composers will very often do things to or with the poem that make it their own, not the poet's. 18th century composers, to put it a little bit differently, had the sense that this is what this poem says, and I want to say that in my music. 19th century composers, by contrast, very often think this is what this poem says to me, and I don't think the poet actually meant that, but I'm going to say it in my music. So what we have is a different level of assertion of the autonomy, the rights, if you will, of those 19th century composers. That's a very important distinction. Additionally, when we're talking about 19th century poetry, one of the most important terms to remember is the lyric persona. We tend to think in the age of singer-songwriters that the person that is the source of utterance in any given song is the composer, right? But in 19th century poetry and in 19th century song, the whole reason for those poems existing as poems was that you could create fictitious characters, and any given poem can have more than one source of utterance. Right? So if you think about Schubert's Erlkönig, which is a setting of a ballade by Goethe, what happens is that we have in Goethe's poem not one lyric persona, not one source of utterance, but at least three. We have a narrator who says, who is this who's riding at night through the darkness and wind? It's the father with his child. Then the father speaks, then the child speaks. Then we also hear the voice of the Erlkönig, who may or may not be inside the child's own mind, and we also hear in Schubert's music the galloping hooves of the horse. Think about that. In that one poem, we have 5 sources of utterance. The term for these sources of utterance, whom we sense in any given poem and whom we hear in composers' music, is lyric persona. Persona means a constructive fictitious voice, and lyric means in a song. Then the other thing we talk about is the form of this musical creation. If the text reuses the same music for different verses of the text, then we say that it is a strophic setting of the poem. If it reuses essentially the same music for different verses, but that music changes its character for one verse or one line or another, then we say it is modified strophic. So to illustrate that one just a little bit, what happens is if you've got a song that is mostly in the major mode, as the poet is saying that this is the springtime and this is the season in which I fell in love, and my love is so beautiful, she is so beautiful, and she reminds me of the flowers. But then in another strophe, that lyric persona says, and yet she did not return my love. And look, there are the gray clouds in the sky, which symbolize this. Then you would not expect that same happy major mode music to continue. No, what you would get instead would be something that turns to the minor, possibly becomes more chromatic. This would be an illustration of modified strophic. The melodies might be essentially the same, there might be a clear pattern of recurrence, but the music changes to illustrate what's happening in the poem, and it breaks the strophic pattern. That's what we call modified strophic. The third category is what we call throughcomposed, where there's not really a discernible pattern of reusing music and or text over the course of the piece. In throughcomposed settings, composers basically set each line of text as its own thing. And this is a very free-form, freestyle way of writing. Just so you know, almost all the popular music that we have today, almost all folk music, is strophic in character. Art songs are more likely to be modified strophic or throughcomposed. The final thing to note is the madrigalisms. Okay? This is what we in the 19th century call text painting, and it essentially means that if there is an image or an idea in the text that the composer wants to conjure up in the performer's and listener's visual imagination, they find a way to suggest it musically. So if you think about Erlkönig, the first thing that you hear in this setting is the pounding, rapid hooves of the horse in those repeated notes of the piano. Hello everybody and welcome to today's Music Lit Sweepstakes. So listen, you know how this works. Within 24 to 36 hours of today's originally scheduled class meeting time, the two people who win today's sweepstakes, excuse me, I ran out of breath back there, will send me an email saying, hey, Dr. Cooper, I see that I won the sweepstakes. What do you want to know? I'll then send you an email reply asking you a short and simple question, and within 24 hours of my sending that, you send me the answer. Once you've done that, you'll get 3 points added onto the final score for your Unit 3 test. So, without further ado, let's ask ourselves, very thoughtfully, who won today's Music Lit Sweepstakes? Well, I'll tell you. Let's turn to our trusty whiteboard and see. Today's first winner is Grace. Grace, congratulations on having won. You know what to do. Send me an email. And today's second winner is Kate. Kate Myers. Send me an email and let me know that you won, Kate, and we'll do the rest from there. All right, thank you guys very much for playing, and I will see you after we return to the rest of today's lecture. Thanks very much. Bye. Oh, cool. We're in a train station. All right, so listen, let's take a quick look at our two examples. Schubert's Erlkönig. The first thing I want you to know is that this piece was written as a ballade, meaning that there is a narrator. The narrator comes on and says, who is it who rides so late at night through the darkness and the wind, etc. Then we later hear the voices of the Father, the Son, and the Erlkönig himself. And this is the presence of that narrator who speaks to us in real time is what makes this a ballade. It's not a lied, and it's also not a Gesang. It is a ballade. It is a German song with narrator. Now, if you look at measure 1 of the piece, you hear the horse's hoofs. If you look at the fourth measure of the second system on page 1 of Erlkönig, you hear the narrator come in. If you hear where the Father comes in, that is the seventh measure of the second system on the second page, and the Son responds on the fifth measure of the third system on the second page. And then the rest of the piece is kind of a dialogue among those different lyric personae. This is how Schubert does it. But as we are going along in this piece, as you know, by having read the poem first and listened to the music, what happens is that Schubert gets more and more urgent in his music, and Goethe does as well. And this is depicted in part by the fact that every time the child's voice comes in, as the Erlkönig is becoming threatening with him, the child's voice moves up into a higher part of the register. This increasingly strained timbre that results from that gives us a sense of the increasing urgency. And the other thing to note about Erlkönig is that it is one of the great twist endings in all of poetry and literature. We're all adults. We listen to this poem and we think to ourselves, haha, an Erlking is a fairy tale creature. It doesn't kill children. And yet, what happens in the course of the poem is that Goethe tells us this story throughout, and the Father is thinking, son, that's just something moving over there in the woods, that's just the clouds, whatever, it's just your imagination, you're going to be fine. And yet the Father is clearly a little bit worried because we're riding through the darkness and wind at late of night, right? And then at the end of it all, though, we don't expect the child to die. We think that this is something like the boogeyman under the bed. But what is the last line of Goethe's poem? The last line says, he reaches the court, and in his arms, the child is dead. Now, the explanation for that is partly that we have a mixture of reality and imagination, partly a mixture of the natural and the supernatural, but also, speaking of this as being something that belongs in an intimate surrounding. This is a world, 19th century Europe, in which the child mortality rate before the age of 10 was somewhere in the order of 40%. In our class of 19 people, probably 4, maybe 3, would not have made it to the age of 10, right? So the Earl King, even though it is about supernatural versus natural, real and imagination, and so on, and has this twist ending, it's also something that is extremely real and relevant to the immediate world of the readers of Goethe's poem, to Schubert's performers, and to Schubert's listeners. And now let's turn to something completely different, the Schwanenlied, Swan Song of Heinrich Heine, set to music by Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel. Fanny Hensel was an extremely talented composer, and Heinrich Heine was an extremely talented poet. And in this particular song, we see those two prodigious artistic imaginations coming together in a beautiful way. The Swan Song, for those of you who don't know, derives from something that was first discussed, I believe, in ancient Greece, which is the notion that the swan lives its entire life in silence. Swans do not sing or speak or make sounds like other birds during their lifetime. They paddle around beautifully and gracefully on the water, but they're silent. And yet, just before the swan dies, so the story of the swan song goes, it opens its mouth and it emits a high, beautiful song. You live your entire life in silence only to sing just before your death. Having sung, it then sinks to its watery grave. Heine's poem takes that image, which is beautiful and very musical in many ways, and creates a setting of it which likens it not only to what happens when we look into the sky and see a falling star, like the swan sinking to its watery grave, but also in what happens with our own lives and loves. We have all, by this point in life, witnessed the death of some person whom we loved. That's like the falling star, like the swan sinking to its watery grave. We have all witnessed the ends of relationships, the swan song of love. Heine creates this elaborate allegory, this set of symbols which reflect each other at different levels as parts of the natural world. And it's kind of a depressing poem, perhaps, because it says that everything in nature will be beautiful in life and will ultimately come to its end. But listen to what Fanny Hensel does with this in her music. The song as a whole is in G minor, and you hear in that busy accompaniment, which rises up and down, very smooth and flowing, you hear the image, you get an image of the swan on the surface of the water, gracefully, beautifully riding across the surface, as its feet beneath the surface, think of those rapid 16th notes, are working furiously to keep the swan afloat. And yet, how does the swan song end? Heine's poem ends sadly, melancholy. All things shall end. But Fanny Hensel writes all of those verses in the minor mode, but she turns to the major mode for the final cadence. Somehow that ending sounds warm, embracing, accepting of the poetry of this image and of this natural process. All of these things go through this, and then when they are done, they sing. So think of that image as you listen to Fanny Hensel's setting of Heinrich Heine's Schwanenlied. All right, and that's all I have for today. I hope you like this autumnal setting that I have. I don't know whether I call this a green screen or what, but I hope you guys are doing well, and I will see you next week. Thanks very much. Bye.